Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. On the morning of April 26, 2003, as the captivating landscape of Utah was slowly bathed in the sun's light, Aaron Ralston made the decision to immerse himself in nature. Throughout his life, Ralston had always loved being one with the natural world. Mountaineering, rappelling, and exploring had become a way of life for him. This time, he had chosen a new destination, Blue John Canyon. Ralston had always seen his desire to be in nature as a search for inner peace. Venturing alone on such explorations gave him a sense of freedom and created a calm in his heart. As he traversed the mountains, valleys, and canyons, solitude brought him tranquility, allowing him to escape the fast pace of life. Blue John Canyon was an area he had never visited before, and it seemed like the perfect place for a new adventure. Known for its massive rocks and narrow passages, the region was a place where nature's raw power came together. However, what awaited Aaron that morning was far beyond the beauty of the surroundings. With the sunrise, the sounds and colors of nature ignited Ralston's passion for exploration. Before setting out, he only packed the essentials: a water bottle, snacks, a first aid kit, rope, and rappelling gear. He believed that no matter what happened, he would be able to survive in nature, even alone. Blue John Canyon, while challenging, was still an area manageable for someone with his experience, but no plan could prepare him for what was about to happen. The journey began peacefully and uneventfully. As the temperature gradually warmed, Ralston made his way over the rocky terrain. Moving between the massive canyon walls, he found small passages between the rocks and used his body control to navigate them. While rappelling up the rocks, he felt a deeper connection with nature with each step. Every climb, every rope knot, brought him closer to the natural world, yet nothing could compare to the real challenge that nature had prepared for him. As Ralston happily made his way through the rocks, he suddenly heard a sound. A rock had started to roll down the slope. In an instant, this rapidly developing situation threw off Ralston's balance. For a brief moment, he lost his footing, and the next move would lead to the biggest disaster of his life. As one of the rocks shifted, his right arm became trapped between two massive boulders. He reacted immediately, but moving the rock was impossible. For a few seconds, he didn't realize the severity of the situation. However, soon enough, he realized his right arm was completely wedged between the rocks, and his entire body tensed in panic. This moment marked a turning point for Ralston. Until that moment, he had felt perfectly in sync with nature, but suddenly, he understood how vulnerable he was to its power. Everything changed in an instant. He faced a massive obstacle and would have to confront nature's wild force head-on. In the past, during his solo adventures, he had never faced any serious danger, but this time, he was up against a test of survival. For a moment, he tried to recall all the survival knowledge and skills he had. In this catastrophe, he realized that he could only rely on himself. At first, he thought the situation might be temporary. Maybe if I apply a bit more force, I can move the rock, he thought, expending his energy trying to shift the boulder. But this thought was overly optimistic. No matter how hard he tried to push, nothing changed. Ralston hadn't yet fully understood the lesson nature was teaching him. What had started as a typical exploration would soon turn into an adventure that would change his life forever. As he made his way further into Blue John Canyon, Ralston began to realize that things weren't going according to plan. At the start, his journey had been calm and peaceful. The breathtaking views, the wind whistling through the rocks, and the warm sunlight had drawn him deep into nature's heart. But suddenly, all this serenity would be replaced by a series of events that would lead to catastrophe. When Ralston reached a narrower part of the canyon, he found it increasingly difficult to maneuver through the rocks. The high canyon walls were so close that his body was pressed against them, and he had to move carefully to avoid being trapped. At times, his feet would slip, or his balance would be thrown off. These were ordinary obstacles one would face while exploring alone in the wilderness. But this time, things were about to take a very different turn. As Aaron made his way next to a large boulder, he failed to notice the ground becoming slippery for just a moment. Suddenly, a rock shifted and began rolling freely down the slope. The rapid movement of the boulder threw off Ralston's balance. As his feet slipped and he started to slide, he realized just how critical his every movement had become. Everything happened so quickly that the harsh conditions of the narrow space he was in made it almost impossible to move. As the rock fell, he tried to defend himself, but the force of the movement jolted him, preventing him from fully dislodging his body. The loss of balance not only caused him to fall but also trapped his right arm beneath the massive boulder with incredible speed and force. Suddenly, a wave of pain engulfed his entire arm. The point where his arm was trapped was so tight and deep that no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't free himself. The weight of the rock felt as if it were crushing his entire body. Despite his efforts, moving the boulder was nearly impossible. The excruciating pain took over Ralston's body, and he had to face nature's challenge once again. For a moment, he thought everything was temporary. Maybe the rock would shift. Maybe he could somehow escape. But as hours passed, his attempts to move the rock were completely in vain. He was so tightly wedged that even moving his arm had become nearly impossible. His trapped arm had become so integrated with the rock, it was as if he were a person leaning against a rock, unable to move it. Impossible. Ralston now felt utterly helpless. In that moment, everything flashed through his mind. Going on solo, adventures, making preparations for his safety, respecting nature. But no matter how ready he was not prepared for such a catastrophe. As he saw how deeply his right arm was trapped beneath the rock, he began to feel something beyond the will to survive, a deep fear, like a nightmare. His mind blurred, and his body began to exhaust. As the hours dragged on, his thoughts and movements slowed, giving him the grim reality that he couldn't stay in this position much longer. The tightness of the space was so overwhelming that it felt as though he had lost all mobility. The muscles in his arm were strained, but at the same time, blood flow was being cut off, making it harder and harder to move. At one point, he even noticed numbness in his arm, and then came the breaking point. No matter how physically hard he tried, he couldn't move the rock. Straining with his body, he tried to use his legs to push the rock, but every effort was in vain. The disaster had arrived unexpectedly, and all of his struggle was starting to make sense in the first major test of his survival. Ralston knew he had to somehow escape this narrow space, but on one side, his body was failing, and on the other, his fight for survival was growing increasingly difficult. Now there was only one option. He had to move the rock or say goodbye to life. Ralston used every ounce of his strength to try to free his right arm from the boulder, but with every passing hour, his desperation deepened. At first he had thought the situation was temporary, and that he would soon be able to free himself. However, as time passed, his battle against nature's wild force became a much greater challenge. In the beginning, he doubled his efforts, hoping to find a way to shift the rock, but every moment spent leaning against the boulder and trying to push it only brought him closer to exhaustion. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move the rock, and he couldn't find anything to release his arm. With each passing minute, the weight on his body grew heavier, and he felt more desperate. The heat of the air made it even harder for him to endure. The muscles in his arm were tense, and blood circulation was almost completely cut off. Every movement intensified the pain. To make matters worse, the scorching sun was slowly dehydrating, him replacing sweat with a growing thirst. He knew he had to ration his water carefully, but the effects of dehydration were starting to take their toll. At first, he tried to survive by carefully managing his water, hoping to last a few days. But with each passing hour, the amount of water he had left dwindled quickly. He took the water bottle a few times, drinking more, but no matter how much he drank, the thirst never went away. Under the cold nights and scorching heat of the days, Ralston pushed himself every day to avoid losing hope. But everything had its limits, and that limit was slowly approaching. His body, along with his dehydration, was beginning to deteriorate. On one hand there was thirst, and on the other his arm trapped by the rock. The pessimistic thoughts in his mind were making his head spin. Despair felt like it was glued to him, attached to the rock. He had no way to call for help. This canyon was in a remote area, and no one knew he was there. He was alone, with no one to help him. His family, his friends, or anyone around him had no idea he was missing. He was left alone with nature and the rocks, caught in between them, fighting for survival. Ralston's psyche was also undergoing a tough test, slowly breaking down along with his physical condition. In his mind, he was caught between accepting this fate and doing whatever it took to survive. On one hand, he was facing death, and on the other, he could feel his strong will to survive. The sense of helplessness gnawed at him with each passing second. A few times the thought of escaping from this torment crossed his mind. However, before he could fall into such deep despair to the point of contemplating suicide, his survival instinct resisted every time. At night, under the stars, as he tried to sleep with his arm trapped between the rocks, his mind constantly searched for ways to hold on to life. Throughout the night, his body twisted in pain. The soreness of his body, the reaction to the hardness of the rocks, continually increased the pain. The tightness in his arm, the tension in his muscles, and the numbness caused by the lack of blood flow were so severe that it almost led his body to give up. In his mind, he thought of the past, his family, his friends, the small moments in his life. But every thought only brought him closer to despair. He had to find a way to survive. During this prolonged fight for mere existence through the nights, it wasn't long before his body grew even weaker. On one hand, the effects of dehydration clouded his mind, and on the other, the pain from his trapped arm was unbearable. Over time, Ralston began to realize that this suffering was taking a toll not only on his body, but also on his mind. Each new day began with a determination to survive, but with each passing hour, the hope of rescue grew thinner. At the point where his arm was trapped, he couldn't find the strength to move the rock, and he was using his water more carefully every day. The only thing keeping him alive was his determination and his will to survive. In his mind, the thought of finding another way to survive was always there, but there was nothing he could do to free his arm from the rock, and with each passing second, he felt more deeply how difficult and painful this fight for survival had become. After 4 days of struggling to free his trapped arm, Aaron Ralston was physically and mentally exhausted. His body was writhing in hunger, thirst, and pain, while his mind was being dragged deeper into the dark abyss of hopelessness, despair, and loneliness. Initially, he had tried various methods to free his arm from the rock, pushing it from every angle, but every effort had been in vain. For a few days, he tried to survive by rationing his water, but the rapidly depleting water supply couldn't last much longer. Slowly, his body began to ache, his muscles weakened, his skin dried, and his numb arm became nearly useless. All he was doing now was trying to survive with his arm trapped between the rocks. Ralston's mind, like his body, was slowly running out of energy. The distinction between night and day had disappeared because he was no longer able to discern the time. His eyes were constantly blurring, his head was spinning, and he was overwhelmed by the sensation of almost losing consciousness. In his mind, with each passing hour, the hope of survival was slowly fading, replaced by dark thoughts. In the early days, Aaron had believed he would find a solution, but now he found himself in moments where he thought everything was over. The pain from his trapped arm had transformed from physical pain to a mental torture. Sometimes he closed his eyes and thought of his past, his family, his friends, the happy moments in his life. But these thoughts only brought him frustration. On one side, there was the loneliness between the rocks, and on the other, there was no way to get help. No one knew he was there, and a cry for help would disappear into the depths of the canyon. For several days, his only thought was escape, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a solution. Despair tightened its grip on his soul with each passing moment. One evening, as he slowly opened his eyes, he realized how weak his body had become. The spot where his arm was trapped now seemed to bear the weight of his entire body. The air was growing colder, and his body couldn't retain any warmth. No matter what position he tried, the constant pain and numbness in his trapped arm made everything harder. For a moment, he thought he couldn't endure any longer. His mind and body were completely exhausted. At that moment, the thought of suicide briefly crossed his mind. Restlessly, he thought to himself, "Maybe I don't have to endure this pain any longer. This might be the place where death finds me." However, in that moment, he felt the power of his will to survive. He told himself, "I have to survive. I don't need to give up this easily, to just vanish. My family, my friends are waiting. For me, I have the right to live." In that moment, a spark of hope lit up in his mind. A resistance to despair was born. He pushed the thought of suicide from his mind and clung to the fight for survival once again. For a moment, instead of giving up easily, like the thought of death that had crossed his mind, he pulled himself together with even more strength. He truly wanted to survive. At that moment, a realization came to him. No matter how difficult it was, he had to find a solution. If he wanted to survive, he would have to make even more effort to get through this. He had hope. He had a solution. This feeling changed him deeply. Slowly, he moved every part of his body once more, trying to keep his hope alive. Considering the rapidly depleting water and limited supplies, he had to do something to bring this hope to life. The strength within him pushed him toward a deeper exploration. He couldn't just settle for pushing the rock trapping his arm anymore. A new idea came to him. If he couldn't completely free his arm from the rock, he would have to find a way to move the rock and free his trapped arm. Slowly and shakily, he looked around the rocks more carefully. Every movement, despite the pain in his arm, was planned meticulously. Now, he would look for a way to cut through the rock. He needed a solution to survive. Ralston, now pushing the limits of both his body and his mind, continued the fight for survival. His mind was beginning to emerge from the darkness of hopelessness. He had found hope again. For 4 days, he had tried every possible way to free his trapped arm. His hope was almost gone, but at one moment a deep inner voice told him, "You have to do this, there's no other way to survive." In his mind, it was now clear that the only way to escape was to amputate his right arm. This was his last resort. Trying to control his thoughts, he focused on clearing his mind and understanding what he had to do. Slowly, gathering his remaining mental strength, he determined what needed to be done. Cut off his arm. However, this would be much harder and more painful than he had imagined. Ralston's body had already been weakened by 4 days of thirst, hunger, fatigue, and pain. Each passing hour, his body was consumed by the effects. When he looked at the rock trapping his arm, the hardness of the rock seemed like a huge obstacle. But there was only one thought in his mind: survival. To live, he had to sever his arm. For a moment, clarity returned to his thoughts. The only solution to freeing his right arm, with its muscles and veins trapped by the rock, was to physically separate it from the rock. In his mind, while accepting the necessity of this difficult action, he also struggled with how to cut off the correct part of his arm. How much to cut, which part to take, became a question that added to the difficulty. But there was no alternative. If he couldn't find a solution, he might die. Cutting off his arm had become the only option for him to continue living. Now, he made the decision to take the necessary steps to amputate his arm. First, he looked at the pocket knife he had with him. As he picked up the knife under the weight of his thoughts, he didn't hesitate for a moment and rolled up his sleeves. The moment he decided to cut off his arm, he was guided solely by his survival instinct. Though this action would bring him immense pain, it was necessary for his survival. The knife, cold and sharp, stood before him. While thoughts of fear and pain flashed through his mind, his survival instinct pushed them aside. Carefully, he positioned the tip of the knife against the tissue surrounding his arm. The first incision caused his body to tremble as the skin and muscles began to sever. A wave of intense pain hit him, reminding him how horrifying and agonizing this was. Yet, despite the pain, he didn't stop. Amputating his arm was the only option for survival, and denying this truth would only bring him more suffering. Each cut brought deeper agony. Severing his muscles, veins, and nerves intensified the physical pain. With every movement of the knife, Ralston proceeded with extreme care and precision. Each strike of the blade into his body brought more suffering, but he kept pushing forward, always trying to take one more step. On one side, the pain reaching his body's limits, and on the other, the need to hold on to life. He had to do this. His body trembled, but there was a determination in his eyes, a drive to survive. With each new cut, the tissue around his arm tore even more, yet he understood the magnitude of the fight for survival. As he drove the knife deeper and more accurately, he was getting closer. Hours passed and the procedure slowly neared its end. Severing the veins in his arm now appeared as a beacon of hope for his continued survival. These moments were some of the most brutal actions a person could take against their own body. But for him, this horrifying act meant reigniting his hope to survive. He continued to work the knife around his arm, and as the cuts progressed, his body seemed to transform into something alien to him. With the severing of muscles and veins, his arm finally detached from the rock. After about 3 hours of excruciating effort, the process was complete. His arm had been fully freed from the rock, leaving behind only the severed limb. Bleeding started rapidly, but at this point, he had found a way to continue his life. He had freed his arm from the rock and, in doing so, entered a new phase of his survival battle. Despite his body being severely strained, he now had a chance at salvation. For the first time in days, he felt a distance from the hopelessness that had been consuming him. Even in shock, a spark of hope emerged after losing his arm. In his extraordinary fight for survival, Ralston had taken another critical step forward. His severed arm had become a symbol of his journey to survive. What had once been a terrible process now had opened a path for him. Having freed his arm from the rock, physically and mentally passing a great trial, Ralston had reached another pivotal moment in his struggle for life. The amputation was not just a painful procedure, it was a step to survival, a fight for liberation. But this fight was far from over. With his arm gone, bleeding and struggling with hunger, he now needed to use all his strength and knowledge to survive. Every step of the way, it was a battle that tested the limits of human endurance. After amputating his arm, the first thing he needed to do was stop the bleeding. With limited resources, he had little choice but to use some of the snacks nearby to help stem the flow. As he attempted to stop the bleeding, his mind was filled with mixed thoughts, relief on one side and fear on the other. After all, his right arm was no longer attached to his body. To survive, he had to accept this new reality. For a moment, he thought about what he could do with his hands. The bleeding from the severed area needed to be controlled. Slowly, he began applying the first aid procedures necessary for survival, using whatever small resources he had. Although it was minimal, it was enough to save his life. He tied his legs to limit the blood loss and began planning how to escape the rock. Using parts of his clothes, he created a makeshift bandage to minimize the bleeding. He also thought about how to escape the rock. His body ached, but in his mind, there was only one goal: escape. Finally, he succeeded in freeing himself from the rock. With a little more confidence, he stood up. His arm was gone, but his survival instinct kept him moving. In pain, he began walking, planning every step carefully. Free from the rocks, Ralston now believed there was only one path left to survival. Walking and reaching the main road, his exhausted body and severed arm, Aaron Ralston continued to move forward with unwavering determination. With every step he took, each movement symbolized a fight for survival. Taking one more step promised to bring him one step closer to freedom. As the days passed, Ralston's fatigue grew stronger. His feet swelled, and his body had grown as light as a feather. Losing his arm had created a tremendous physical burden, but somehow he kept moving forward. Slowly, he managed to keep his body alive, with only a few drops of water and snacks left in his backpack. The struggle for survival transformed with each passing moment into not just more physical pain, but also greater willpower. The obstacles he faced in the dark voids of the mountains and rocks only made him stronger. At the end of one day, after an arduous journey, he reached the main road. Reaching the road wasn't just a geographical point for him, it was a symbol of survival. In that moment, Ralston realized that he had not only freed himself from the rock, but also shown how far a person could go to continue living. He understood that survival was not only a physical, but also an emotional and spiritual journey. Shortly after getting onto the road, a car appeared. The driver immediately noticed Ralston's condition and took him to the hospital. Finally, after 5 grueling days of survival, the ordeal was over. Ralston was physically drained but alive. Losing his arm had come at a great cost, but it had also left behind a powerful survival story. After receiving treatment at the hospital, Ralston wrote a book about his survival struggle. Between a Rock and a Hard Place told not only the story of a nature explorer's fight for survival, but also how courageous and determined a person could be when pushed to the edge. The book garnered worldwide attention. Aron Ralston quickly became a hero everyone talked about. He symbolized not only a person's ability to survive, but also people's resilience and courage in difficult times. Ralston's terrifying experience went beyond physical survival. It became a reflection of the courage, determination, and willpower within a person. He showed everyone the power of survival and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. This 5-day journey transformed Aron Ralston from just a nature lover into something far more, a hero